Welcome to the Dancing into Brain Health podcast. I am your host, Magda Kaczmarska. Dance transcends words, cultures, and generations. Through rhythm, gesture, and movement, dance allows us to communicate emotion, tell stories, and connect with one another in deeply human ways. But what if dance does more than communicate? What if it can actually help us to speak? In this episode of Dancing into Brain Health, we're joined by dancer and neuroscientist Dr. Constantina Theofanopoulou, whose groundbreaking research investigates the neural substrates of speech and the ways movement, particularly dance, may support, strengthen, and even rehabilitate our ability to communicate. Dr. Constantina Theofanopoulou is a Herbert and Neil Singer Research Assistant Professor at Rockefeller University, visiting scholar at the Jameel Arts and Health Lab at New York University, research associate at Emory University in the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, and visiting faculty at Yale University. Her research is uncovering how rhythm and movement may activate some of the brain's deepest communication networks, opening new possibilities for understanding speech, connection, and the profound relationship between the moving body and the speaking mind. Constantina, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to join me in conversation today.
Hi, Magda. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for supporting this field and for the diffusion of the arts and sciences that you promote. It's really so necessary.
Oh, thank you. I can say the same about yourself. And so for our listeners, this is a really special opportunity because, Constantina, you were our first guest on the podcast over a year ago. So I'm delighted that we have a chance to connect with you again and for our listeners to get a chance for a deeper dive into your work and also to have a chance to see you. And
Likewise.
hopefully we'll be sharing also some of the images of your work. I'm really, really excited. And you are a really spectacular individual because you somehow managed to balance a career that's not just involved in this leading neuroscience research, but also in professional dance. And so to me, I imagine that it takes a certain level of audacity and particular and unique determination to pursue these two passions. Each of them in their own right is incredibly demanding. I wonder if you think back on your development, whether as a child or as a young adult, was there something specific that led you into this path?
This is a really wonderful question because for the most of my life, these two passions, dance and science and neuroscience in particular, have been truly separate, although they were my two biggest passions. And the one was fitting into another in several different ways. So I remember very clearly that my anticipation to go to my dance classes was really making me a really good student when it comes to finishing my homework in time for the class. So I can see in many different ways how both of them shape together my discipline. But it was until pretty recently, meaning some years ago, until they actually converged and became more of the same, meaning until I started working on the neuroscience of dance and of the arts in general. So my biggest passion in neuroscience was more related with how we humans are able to speak. And for this, I started working on this beautiful avian species that sing really beautifully and in many complex ways. And I'm talking about hummingbirds, songbirds, parrots. And for a long, long time, it seemed that these two passions, speech, the neuroscience of speech, and dance were really, truly separate. Until this very interesting finding came, which was that parrots, the species that along with humans are the ones that are able to communicate vocally in the most complex fashion. Parrots are not only able to do that, they're also able to dance. And so this created this important question in my mind, which is this a coincidence? Is this a coincidence that only humans and parrots, the two species in the animal kingdom that are the most advanced in their abilities to vocally communicate, are also the species that are able to entrain their body movements to to rhythm. So it's basically science itself and this finding that brought together my two worlds, rather than my passion for dance and neuroscience coming together to unfold the neurobiology of dance. So yeah, this is part of the story, and this is part of, I would say, this important moment that led to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that discipline that you mentioned is something that maybe perhaps individuals who haven't met or engaged in dance don't really understand or appreciate perhaps how much discipline is required. I r- recall when I was in graduate school, many of the BFA students, the undergraduate dance students, had at least double majors in dance and physics or nutrition. Or I find it admirable, and I hope that more people can appreciate the skill sets that dancers acquire, not just in embodiment and entrainment, but also how they might transfer and translate to other professions, including neuroscience. I also think that that's fascinating about that mechanism of entrainment. I know that we're going to get a chance to talk about that a little bit later. Learning and training movement is actually a quite complicated thing, although to us as humans, it feels like one of the most natural things that we seem to do. And it seems to precede speech, I would say. So I'm curious to ask about that. But first, I wanted to ask another question. A lot of the work that you have been doing, although it's not exclusively pertaining to these communities, sometimes involves individuals who are living with neurodegenerative conditions, specifically Parkinson's disease. Is there anything that inspired your passion for working with this community, or was it again a kind of happy divergence of the work calling you to it?
Well, there were several levels of reasons, right? So from more academic professional to more personal. So at a more professional level, when I came into this world of studying the neurobiology of dance and studying how dance-based interventions could alleviate several behavioral and brain effects that we see in neurodegenerative disorders. So when I came into this field, I actually found that there was a huge background from people like you in dementia, from people like David Leventhal in Parkinson's, or Madeline Hackney with the ADAPT Tango protocol. So there was a huge work as a background that was already tested for its safety and efficacy. We would be speaking about a completely different trajectory of mine if it were for me to need to create a new and test for safety and efficacy a protocol for people with neurodegenerative disorders. So I was really thankful to have a strong basis, a strong springboard on where to just jump and be able to generate research. And I'm really thankful for all these people who have done this work all these years. So I think that this was more of a, like timing coincidence, where the time when I stepped into this field, I was lucky enough to find this built background. And then I think that this comes from, as I said, more professional to even more global reasons. So indeed, we live in a world where we have a continuously aging population that is in urgent need of really targeted care. So I found that this population is indeed in urgent need of care, and that it would really make me passionate to contribute in any way that I could in this direction. And also lastly, at a more personal experiential level, my grandmother very recently died from dementia. So
I'm sorry to
it
hear
was very
that.
yeah, thank you. So it was very interesting to see, because as a neuroscientist, we have this background of what are the cardinal symptoms of several neurodegenerative disorders, how they progress, what comes first, what is supposed to come second or third, how different, like stages express themselves with different outcomes. So it was really interesting for me to go through these readings and this background and this training on a day-by-day cases with a person that I love and with a person that was really close to me, and see how the symptoms were really unfolding day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, and how the disorder, the disease, was ending up occupying basically all aspects of behavior expression of the person. But I was really also lucky to be able to witness how, even when my grandmother had completely lost her speech, almost completely lost her speech, when we were starting to sing her favorite song, she was singing along. And of course, this is not the first time that this is being done or proven. Yeah. There is a lot of literature in the background that led me to be doing this with my grandma. But it was very, very important and just life-changing for me to see how tapping into the rhythm can really bring up and awaken something that lies in a background that is really difficult to recover.
Yes, I want to start by saying thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry to hear that your grandmother has passed, but I'm grateful to you for sharing that experience and how wonderful it is that she had a granddaughter like yourself who could bring that level of understanding on so many different levels, of what was going on, what was happening for her, and also apply that in a way that helped you connect in a really meaningful way in this both embodied and visceral way as well as an expressive way. I think you've positioned us really well for this upcoming conversation, even just with this. Um, I also really appreciate that all of the work in this field of dance and health, like even though it's comparatively a relatively young field, I mean, even the field of neuroscience itself is a relatively young field compared to other systematic modes of study. But dance and health research is relatively recent. But what's surprising to me is when I was at the Global Brain Health Institute, diving into the web and the pool of research, I myself was really shocked and surprised at how much actually already exists. It makes me wonder, one, do we need to maybe give more of a forum to the existing research? And also, how can we better grow what we know and to strengthen the quality of the research so that it is actually applicable and translatable? And I feel like that is partially what you're doing. And I thank you for kind of applying your experience as a dancer into that, because I think that means that whatever research you design and implement is going to be not only deeply rooted in that really rigorous academic neuroscience practice, but it's also going to do it right by the dance community. And I hear you already shouting out some of the people who, like Dr. Madeline Hackney, who is also a dancer as well as a researcher, and obviously David Leventhal, thanks to whom the Dance for PD program has now reached almost every corner of the globe. So it's really remarkable how far we've come already. And there's definitely a lot more that we can do. So I want to come back to that aspect of dance for Parkinson's disease, right? And I think for probably many of our audience at this point, and largely I would say thanks to people like Dr. Hackney and David Leventhal and the Mark Morris Dance Group, thanks to them, when we think about dance and aging or dance and neurodegenerative conditions, dance for Parkinson's disease is ubiquitous at this point. Everybody will instantly think like, oh, yes, have you heard about that? Which I think is fantastic. But I remember when I first started, she trained with David when I was living in Arizona. So this was when the program was still fairly young. And at that point, I remember when I attended a Parkinson's Congress in Arizona, it was quite radical, the concept of dance. And many people said, well, no, this is actually going to make symptoms worse. This can't possibly be helpful. And yet, here we are today. And what's interesting, what I was struck with when I first started working with dance with people living with Parkinson's, is that people with Parkinson's don't just experience changes in their mobility, they do actually experience changes in their speech. And your research is starting to unpack some of those connections. Can you speak a little bit to what drives some of those mechanisms that connect movement, dance, mobility, and speech?
Absolutely. And I think that the key word for what we're going to talk about is similarities or potentially overlapping brain circuits for speech and dance, and how this can be so important for dance for Parkinson's. The key word is movement, is anything motor, because for so long, speech has been understood as this expression of sound and communication through sound. And people have really focused their understanding of what speech speech and language is on the auditory domain. It is a form of communication that uses signals, and in many cases for people that communicate through spoken communication, it uses auditory signals. What we do not think of very often is that these same signals are actually vocal outputs. They're produced as vocal signals that are perceived as auditory signals. And for this term vocal, what we immediately say once we utter the word vocal is motor, because vocal means the movement of the laryngeal orofacial muscles in order to generate this sound that we get as an output. So for me, this is something that has been really clear from my background in linguistics and the neuroscience of speech. And the reason why, to begin with, I was studying songbirds to understand human language, because they have similar systems where they move very similar organs in order to reach this very similar actually result. So for me, when I saw that humans and parrots can both speak, sing in a very complex way, but also move in a very complex fashion and rhythmically, for me there is something in the motor pathways that led these two species, for different reasons maybe, reach the same result at an evolutionary scale. So for me, when I'm hearing that people with Parkinson's, where the most famous thing about Parkinson's is the motor symptoms, right? To have tremor, bradykinesia, etc., etc. So when I'm hearing about speech deficits in Parkinson's, for me, it's not surprising. It's basically the same thing as we were talking about. Parkinson's disease is, at a very basic stage, a motor disorder, right? So of course it will include a speech disorder as well. Although this is something that's really very straightforward and not surprising, for me, it doesn't seem to be the case for the rest of the community and communities or the field. But indeed, what research has shown, and questionnaires and research on the vocal folds and how the vocal folds progress through the progression of the disease, is that indeed most of people with Parkinson's disease suffer from speech deficits. We're talking about 70 to 89% of people with Parkinson's suffer from speech deficits. And actually, about 20 to 30% of them, they mention it as the first symptom from which they suffer the most. And this is really surprising to many people, even in the field. So what I figured was that, well, if really the brain works in similar ways when it comes to producing movement, whether this is for speech or dance or for different purposes, then we might find a way to target this pathway, both for the movement, overall limb body movement, but also for the speech. And this is how this project came about.
Wow. You're right. I think we're conditioned to think about the output, right? So we think about, well, the output of dance is a movement. Therefore, that's a motor pathway. The output of speech or singing is sound. Therefore, that is an auditory or sound pathway. And similarly, a wonderful mentor of mine, Dr. Bruce Miller, studies frontotemporal dementia. And in seeing patients and seeing people who are living with frontotemporal dementia over his career, he started to notice that many of them expressed themselves artistically in really powerful ways. And when they started to look in the brain, they noticed that for quite a few of these individuals, even though the frontal lobes were diminishing, the occipital lobes that are connected to speech, to visual stimuli, were growing, were liberated. And what was fascinating, though, is that when they looked deeper, they also noticed that motor pathways were also activated. And they were surprised by that. Why are we surprised by that? Like, the art doesn't just jump from our eyes into action. Our eyes take in the surroundings and they help dictate what we're seeing, but the body is the one that is generating that artwork, right? So I think we as a society have a lack of appreciation of how embodied we actually are. And hearing and learning about your study, I was like, I never thought about speech and singing as a motor action, but it kind of is a small dance, right? If you think about, I speak multiple languages, I know you do as well, right? You have to form your mouth in very specific ways to articulate sounds in Polish versus French versus Chinese, completely different and very specific motor mechanisms in order to generate those sounds, which I think we just don't appreciate that.
Absolutely. And our laryngeal muscles are of the fastest moving muscles of our bodies. And there is such incredible work on how, for example, we move our jaws and our mouths when we speak, where it's very interesting that these jaw movements, so the jaw movements tend to demarcate mostly what we would call syllables, mouth, lips, tongue, and other movements. They demarcate more what we would call kind of phonemes in between. So there's these more specific signals. And so when babies start babbling, they start shaping this same rate, meaning timing rate of movement of the jaw that we keep practicing and we keep expressing ourselves through that for the rest of our lives. More fascinating phylogenetically, if we go to other species, to find out that species like marmosets, when they vocalize, they follow the same rate in their jaw opening and closing. So we're talking about movements that are phylogenetically conserved, and then each species has its own ways to just fill their niche and do whatever else is necessary. But largely, whatever has been found is really truly conserved across species, which is really, really fascinating to me, especially when it comes to the human uniqueness and so on and so on and so forth. I think when we get really in the nitty-gritty of our function and of things like, the timing of our jaw movements, it is there that we realize that we're part of an animal kingdom and we are just, like another species.
Well, that's interesting. So did I understand correctly that other species kind of maintain the same rhythm when they're producing sound, but for humans, we kind of vary the rhythm of our jaw as we express different sounds?
It is the same rhythm.
Oh,
So it
wow.
is the same pattern of opening and closing. The rate of opening and closing the jaw has been found to be pretty consistent between humans and other
Oh,
species like
wow.
macaques. This is, I think, really very interesting because it shows that we basically, in a more Darwinian understanding of the things, we have a toolkit that has pretty similar tools and we put them in function in different ways and we tinker in different niches to just find what works best for its species. But overall, for many of our initial primary functions, we are finding conservation across species. And I think that this is really fascinating, especially when it comes to the arts, because back when I was only studying speech and I was using songbirds to understand more the neurobiology of speech, it was kind of more accepted, right? You're studying some other species to understand something that we humans have. Of course, there are still these scientists that would say, if birds don't speak, why would you study birds? But there are all these commonalities that make it important for us to understand our behavior through other species. And so when it comes to the arts, I think people would criticize even more those who would like to understand the arts through studying other species. But I think that this is where it will get in some people have already started doing that, but I think that this is where the field will also get in some years, where the arts are actually building on some very primary tools that other species have too. And it's not that we are so unique, and the arts is not just, like the utmost expression of humanity and is unique to us and no one else has it. I think that aspects and pieces of the puzzle are there in the animal kingdom, and it just remains to be found.
I love that. And I think you're right. It is very challenging. We do have this exceptionalism that we are somehow different. And I know this is really shocking and radical. And I have never really understood that, why we need to differentiate ourselves so much from the rest of the world. But I do recognize that it is something that a lot of people experience. I recall like learning that we have artistic expression, right? Like thinking about the first handprints on walls and different carvings that are not just utilitarian, but they're serving some other purpose of whether it's communication or artistic expression, that we have identified that as distinct identifier of our humanity. So it's interesting to hear that we are actually not the only species that does that. And yet,
I,
we've been finding that in other aspects, right? So why shouldn't that also be the case?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it really depends on the level of analysis, on the level of
Mm,
organization where we're looking into the questions and the answers. Because if we were to look for a painting or a vase or a choreography or something along these lines of complexity in other species, then probably we wouldn't find
yeah.
it. But if we are to look at the level of biology in the sense of, okay, do other species communicate through limb movements that are rhythmic in some way? So if we deconstruct dance down to segments like this or down to grains of this kind, then probably we would be able to find seeds in other species. So I think it really being able to look at the behavior, take dance or speaking, both bottom up and top down, and looking at specific levels of organization and not only at the outmost output.
Mm-hmm. And I think that lends itself, even within the application within our human kind of communities, right? See this closest in dance because that has been my practice, but um, we as a community, as well, not all of us. I don't think it's universal, and definitely hasn't been that way historically. But definitely, we're speaking right now in New York and the United States. And in this society, especially in our current generation, many of us beyond a certain age don't really feel comfortable dancing. Or even if we do dance, we will deny that we can quote unquote dance, or will certainly not call ourselves dancers. And even within professional spaces, I even find this myself. It happened yesterday. I was coming out of Pilates, and the instructor asked me if I was a dancer, and I paused and I said, "Well, I used to be." And like, wait a second, I actually run a dance company. So like, yes, I should still identify as a dancer, right? So we have this really narrow vision of what a dancer can be, who has the right to claim that title for themselves. And it tends to be restricted to a specific type of training and um, a certain percentage of your professional livelihood being dedicated to presenting dance in a public forum in some capacity. And anything outside of that does not get to be called dance or dancer, which is highly limiting and
Mhm.
really denies us of something that we have probably been doing since before we were human, possibly.
Exactly. Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And it's really interesting for me to ask the generations with which I work at the laboratory, like undergrads,
Yeah.
graduate students, postdocs. I keep asking them if dance is part of their social lives.
Mm,
And I keep getting different versions of no. And then the yeses are more around organized type of dancing, such as salsa social at some
mm,
club. And my youth was really very different, where dance was an integral part of having fun and of socialization. And I remember I was really evaluating the fun that I had one night based on how much I had danced and how much I had sweat. I consider myself really lucky to have gone through such an upbringing through dancing, let's say. And I don't see it happening. I wouldn't really want to just, like say whether this is good or bad, because I think that in the same way as it happened with through others from other species
yeah.
to ourselves, still the evolutionary clock is ticking. And evolution is something that's happening. And of course, health wise, we could label some things as positive or negative. But what I do think is that definitely we come endowed to
Yes.
dance, and we have all the necessary toolkit to to dance. So it would be great if we used it, and if we use it for other purposes, the same toolkit,
Mm,
that's great. Still, we are in a loneliness epidemic, and
yes.
so we should be looking for ways to uh, socialize in the broad sense of the term. And personally, I cannot think of a better way
Yes.
than dance to socialize. Of course, it would be to speak with people, to have a conversation. But I definitely think that dance and dance in a non-judgmental kind of like framework and context can really be so liberating and make people feel unlonely.
Yes, and research is definitely pointing to that. I might have some bias because I'm very much involved in the work, but I do perceive that there is, at least from when I first started having these conversations years ago to where things are now, there is a wider recognition of the fact that dance can be accessible to older persons, to people with different abilities and different ages, and even who may be living with certain conditions. And that, we can dance in our seat, we can dance in a wheelchair, we can dance jumping through the air in a trapeze. There's lots of different ways that we can dance.
Exactly.
But I agree with you. Dance, actually, one of the biggest things that we say about dance is that it increases mood and a sense of belonging. So, coming back to that connection of Parkinson's disease and dance, you recently completed a study with actually a mutual colleague of ours, Dr. Aline Haas in Brazil. Dr. Haas has been leading a phenomenal program for people living with Parkinson's disease in her city and actually reaching people not just in her city, but actually across Brazil through dance. And so it's been really exciting to see that you just recently completed a study that has been pre-printed, so y'all can read it in the show notes. That's kind of helped place this hypothesis into practice. Could you tell us a little bit about what this study was seeking to explore and what you uncovered?
Absolutely. What I would also like to say, because my background lies more in the neuroscience aspect of things. So what really leads me to hypothesize that dance could be impactful for speech is that I've talked about this parrot evidence, right? But then we have evidence in humans where there is a lot of research in tetraplegic individuals, where most of the research in people with tetraplegia focuses on trying to restore their hand movements. And so there are amazing studies where electrodes are implanted on this specific part of the primary motor cortex that controls hand movements in order to restore hand movements or to understand what's happening in the brain while they do produce hand movements or while they're trying to produce hand movements. So these colleagues of mine had implanted electrodes on this area of the primary motor cortex that is very known to produce hand movements. And what they actually found was that not only did it fire when their patient was producing hand movements, it was also firing when the patient was speaking.
Wow.
And so this was really in stark contrast with what has been thought for a long time in the literature in neuroscience, which is this model of pain field, namely that in the primary motor cortex in our brains, there are very distinct areas that control hand movements, leg movements, laryngeal movements. So this, for someone like Painfield and the colleagues back then, I suppose, would really come as a great surprise. And then what we did was that we said, okay, let's take it a bit further. And this work is still unpublished. So what we did was that we compared what's happening in the brains of healthy adults in fMRI, what's happening in their brains while they speak, versus while they produce rhythmic movements. And we also added some control movements, namely what's happening in the brain while we just try to grasp something. This is not a rhythmic movement. Or what's happening in the brain while we produce laryngeal muscle movements that are not speech movements. We also move our laryngeal muscles while we cough or while we laugh, for example.
Okay.
This is
I never
not
think about
happening,
that.
or even when we breathe. This is not happening in the same strict rhythmic fashion as it happens in speech. So we did compare all these different movements, right? And what we found was that there was a statistically significant overlap of what's happening in the brain, of which areas light up when we speak and when we dance, when we produce these rhythmic movements of the hands, of the legs, etc., etc. And we did not find such an overlap when we were comparing speech rhythmic laryngeal movements with leg non-rhythmic movements. So I think what this data led me to hypothesize is that maybe the primary motor cortex functions not in terms of effector, not in terms of the muscle that I decide to control, but maybe in terms of function. Namely, if I decide to move rhythmically, independently of the effector, independently of the muscle, I will probably choose a specific part of the primary motor cortex. And I don't mean to say that there is no differentiation between the muscles that are controlled by specific neurons, but there is more of a hybridization pattern than what used to be the general understanding. So, of course, this led me to hypothesize that, well, if there is some overlap between the brain areas that we activate while we speak and while we dance, then it could be that by dancing, in case of Parkinson's, for example, we don't only activate the parts of the brain that are responsible for rhythmic movements, we also unwillingly activate the same parts of the brain that get activated during speaking. And so the hypothesis would be, okay, then is there any evidence that dance and dance in neurodegenerative disorders has any effect on speech performance? And so I went to the literature, and there are all these great studies that were going around the question. Back then, there was really no one that had studied this question in particular, but there are all these interesting cognitive tests that help you kind of pick into the question without really asking this specific question. So there was some improvement in several speech and general language measurements, but really no one had tested this directly back then. So I was really happy to get to know Aline Haas and her group in Brazil. They operate with an Amazonian dance-based protocol, which is a protocol that for a big part of Brazil, it is really culturally resonant. And so we run this study where there was one group that was doing Amazonian dance for 12 weeks, and our control group was doing Nordic walking for 12 weeks. And we measured, in this case, only behaviorally. Is there any change in the speech performance of the former and the latter group before versus after they've completed their intervention? And basically, wherever we found improvement, this was in the Amazonian dance groups, and specifically where really the results seem to be very, very strong, where in the prosody, in the pitch that we use when we communicate, which I found really very interesting because it really touches and targets this specific question of the laryngeal muscles and how the laryngeal muscles activate the vocal folds and how they vibrate with each other in order to produce speech and produce this specific fundamental frequency that characterizes its person's vocal identity. So it was really interesting to find an improvement in that. And although it was not a central part of my hypothesis, but it is equally important, we also found changes at the more semantic level. Namely, we very often see in people with neurodegenerative disorders, both Parkinson's and even more so dementia, that there are deficits when it comes to the semantic specificity with which they refer to things. So what we found was that dance for Parkinson's, that it also led to improvement in semantic specificity, semantic organization when compared to Nordic walking. So this was really one of the first times that it was directly tested whether dance impacts speech. And we found improvement, which is just really, really interesting for me. And it really opens up newer avenues for this research agenda.
Yeah, I find that incredibly exciting, actually. I've often felt that there's a correlation between dance and communication, at least. And it's incredibly validating to hear that individuals can not only receive through the practice of dance more fluency, I guess you might say, in their embodied expression, but that embodied expression can also translate to a more melodic fluidity in speech that I think is really beautiful. It comes back to what you introduced before, this idea that speaking is actually a really tiny dance. But I also am excited by that. The understanding of the semantic organization being amplified because, particularly in the work that we do, we're really thinking about these intentional ways of utilizing choreographed patterns and recall to facilitate expression And to know that that may actually be supporting individuals who are experiencing dementia to really not just be training an embodied sense of communication, but potentially even semantic, language-based communication is really exciting. Obviously, we need more research, and I wish upon the research, whoever decides these things, your peer reviews, that you are able to continue this work. It's fascinating and also so liberating, right? We talked about isolation, but one of the things that we experience and we hear so often, both from the people that we meet in our work with people living with dementia, but also what we hear from our colleagues who are advocates who are living with dementia, speaking about their peers, is that lack of facility and ease of communication is really combined with the stigma and the other experiences of living with dementia, really isolates individuals and shrinks their world at a time when they most need community and the connection. So to know that by doing something that's so joyful and uplifting, we are not only building community and increasing mood and doing all these other really wonderful things that we all understand dance to do, but we might actually have very tangible cognitive benefits that can actually extend that ease of connection.
Yeah. And what I would really want to add is that you're having a great point there where you're highlighting that one of the criticisms that any effect, any improvement is thanks to the socialization and the feeling better effect. And I think that what's really important about this work that we did in collaboration with a group in Brazil, but also in other work that we're completing and that we are designing to run, is that we are creating designs where our control groups are involved in a task, in a group setting, in a group context. So the Nordic walking was done with a companion. In a study that we are starting right now in collaboration with Dance for Parkinson's Disease, our control group will be doing both walking and pedaling, and both of these activities will be done with a companion. So I think that one important thing, and it was absolutely necessary in the first studies, is to match the physical activity. Absolutely. Dance is a physical activity for sure. So any control group should better match that. But the social component is important as well, and is the component that we want to go beyond. So I think that it is really necessary for trials to include control groups with this social component replicated as in the experimental ones as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. And part of our work, we speak with communities about not just engaging communities with programs, but also helping share with them why the program that we offer in community is designed the way it is. Like, what's the foundation of this from a scientific standpoint? And one of the things that people mention is, oh, well, when we're comparing, let's say, being on a stationary bike versus dance, well, they're both aerobic activities, obviously, but dance is social. And that's often something that people mention. So I love that you're taking that into consideration and being able to level out whatever impact happens is going to be above because both interventions are matched for that input, I guess. I love that you're doing that. I always come back to this because I don't think that dance needs to be validated. It's wonderful in and of itself. But as somebody who has been fighting for years at this point for dance and dancers and what we do, what many dancers out there in the world have been doing for many, many years, is to recognize that value beyond just what we've already allocated with regards to value, right? Of course, we think dance is valuable, but it's always the first thing that we cut. And we always say that it's great, but this thing is so much better if you're wanting to apply it in a certain context.
Exactly. And also when it comes to other levels such as policy and arts prescribing and this whole movement, we need the evidence to persuade those who need to be persuaded. Yes. And I think it's a fair request to have the evidence, and this is one of the reasons why we're building this evidence, not only out of mere personal and scientific interest. So I think it will be necessary to have this body of work, and that very likely, very soon, sooner than later, we will be talking about dance as an intervention at the same level as other physical therapy, occupational therapy, drug-based interventions. And this is really necessary in many aspects, and I mentioned policy, but I think that also socially speaking, for quote-unquote dance to be taken seriously.
Yes, 100%. I don't work in education, but I hear from colleagues who work in education, whether it's in higher ed education, where so many dance programs are being cut, or in public school education. We're very fortunate in New York City that we actually have a lot of schools that involve dance very strictly. But in many areas, not only arts and dance education, it doesn't exist in schools, but even physical education and breaks is being cut. So being able to understand and validate not just the physical components and benefits, but actually some of these cognitive benefits, I think is crucial for the well-being of our future generations as well as those that are aging.
Exactly.
So thinking about building that body of work, of research. You mentioned very briefly that you are currently engaging in a research study with David Leventhal, the Mark Morris Dance Group's Dance for PD program. Remarkable, and one of the first programs, if not the first program, to really place this connection of dance and Parkinson's disease on the map. Can you speak a little bit about this study and also what else is on the horizon?
Absolutely. So we're currently recruiting participants for the study that is going to be based in New York City, and I'm really happy about that because I've run several different studies in different places, and this one is really at home and in collaboration with Dance for PD that uses a protocol that I really truly believe in. It will be accompanied by live music, and we will have two live musicians, a pianist and a percussionist, for example, which really helps people embody the pulse and the rhythm and the movement in unique ways. So our study takes place in 12 weeks. So people will be randomized either to the dance group, Dance for PD, or to a control group where they will be doing walking and pedaling. What is really very important and unique about this study, actually many things, I think. I'll mention just some of them. First thing is that for the dance group, we will be enrolling people who won't have danced more than a year prior to the study. And we're doing this to avoid ceiling effects. All the previous studies that included people and assigned them to the dancing routine, they used participants that had already been involved in Dance for Parkinson's disease or in similar other dance programs, or they had a mixture of people. Some people had been involved, some others had not been involved. And this is an important covariate. This is an important variable that might be changing the results in one way or another.
Certainly.
So we really don't want to hit, in our case, ceiling effects, and we really want to include people that are as newbies as possible in the dance world in order to understand what's really happening when you start engaging in the dancing activity. So I think that this is something, a very important part of this work, and that makes recruitment more difficult because many of the previous studies really relied on those that are just fun off the program, right? So this is one thing. The other thing that I think is really important is that, to my knowledge, it will be the first study that includes a sample, namely the number of participants, will be big enough to help us understand whether we reached in several of our measurements statistical significance. So we will be recruiting 44 participants in total, if not more. And I would say that the other thing that is really just new in the field is that we will be taking not only connectivity, but also several task-based brain measurements, both before and after. the dance or the control intervention, we will have a huge array of tasks where people will be doing things from moving their legs to speaking to doing rhythmic tapping with their hand while they're in the scanner. So we really want to get the full range of what dance has an effect on in the brain. And this is really making me passionate about this study because we will get to know new things for something that has been done for many, many years.
I'm so delighted that you're doing this. I hope that if any doctors are listening to this, please refer your patients to this study. And for those in the community, please share it with your friends. This is so wonderful. I do have a question though. So, for those people who do get randomized into the walking study, do they have a chance, an opportunity to join the dance program after the study's done so they don't miss out on the dancing?
Exactly. And that's really very important. Absolutely, yes. The answer is a caps lock yes. They will have access. They will have access to the Dance for PD program, which is, of course, given for free. So after the 12 weeks of the control routine,
So they just have to wait
they
for
will
3 weeks,
they
3 months, right?
3 months, and then they would be welcomed to the Dance for PD group if they wish
Oh,
to
great.
attend these classes. Yeah, and this is one of the ultimate aims to attract people to the to the dance program, because many people that come to us through the recruitment, they just had not heard of Dance for PD. Although, as you said in the beginning, it is pretty known and it is now a staple in the field. Still, there are people who didn't know about it. So they get to know about the study. And by extension, whether they are randomized to one group or the other, they will then be able to attend Dance for PD classes if they want for the rest of their lives.
That's fantastic. I'm delighted to hear that. For those who are interested, we have a link in the show notes that if you want to join the study, if you want to share it with somebody who you think might be interested, please pass it along. We need more research, and this sounds super, super cool. Also, I'm delighted because I love David Leventhal. I love this group and this community. I think they're a model of how to exist and how to show up. And really, they've uplifted not just the community of people living with Parkinson's disease, but they've uplifted the community of dance. And there are now so many dancers around the world who have received this training in a really accessible way and are part of a community. I mean, it's remarkable. So I'm delighted that one, they're being celebrated, that you're partnering with them, and that in so doing, there's even more recognition of this wonderful work. I'm curious, is there anything else on the horizon that you'd like our listeners to think about or that they might be able to get involved with?
Other things that we are preparing are results from our study in collaboration with Emory University and Madeline Hackney, where we had 2 trials. In one of the trials, people were doing adaptango for 12 weeks, and the control group was doing walking. And in the other study, we actually separated out the tango groups into leaders, followers, and the control group was going through an educational program of conversation about topics that are interesting to people with neurodegenerative disorders. So I think that what is really interesting for me is to see the impact of dance-based interventions through different protocols. So the tango protocol is a very different protocol. And it is indeed the case that we might expect to find, and we are finding in our analysis so far, different connectivity patterns as a result of an intervention of 2 weeks of people that were only leaders in the tango program and others that were only followers in the tango program. So we are getting to understand how different movement pathways operate and which of them might be more helpful for people with Parkinson's. We know from a lot of background literature that externally generated movements, namely movements that have something that you can grab in your external environment. So for example, if you play a music and you have someone with Parkinson's walk to the rhythm of the music versus if you had them walk by themselves, that they're more likely to walk better if they do so to the rhythm of the music. So when it comes to our study of tango, we want to see whether being led by someone else, namely adding also on top of the music, this tactile and other feedback and other levels of feedback, whether it is more helpful or whether it is more helpful for some circuits in people with Parkinson's disease versus what's happening in the leaders, those that do have to take this initiative guided by the rhythm, but not guided by someone else in a more like a tactile fashion. So we're getting to understand better these nuances, which I think is really fascinating. And we'll be looking very much forward to sharing these results with the world. And also just a big shout to students and people working in my team and in collaborators team who will be presenting work in June in Philly in the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity conference, and in July in New York City at the Performing Arts Medicine Association conference. So there we will be presenting our findings in relevant work about dance in healthy people, where we are trying to identify through electroencephalography what happens in the brain of 5 professional dancers while they're dancing together. Is it that their brains are synchronized? And if so, which are the brain regions where we find these patterns of synchronization? And what I can say here, what we're expecting to find, but the brain areas that showed synchronization were not only the motor visual domains, but of course we found synchronization in oscillations that were found in other brain areas that are more famous for memory or emotional processing. So I think that we're getting to understand better the neural underpinnings of dance, and also in a social setting, which we've shared the reasons why it is so important.
Yeah. So dance is potentially not only supporting speech, semantic, language. Let's use a word that's more colloquial. So speech, language, mood, but also potentially our social cognition as well as mobility. So we're kind of ticking away at some additional benefits. I love this. And coming back to the study that you're running with Dr. Hackney and the adapted tango protocol, I'm recalling studies that looked at like tandem. Is it called tandem biking, where you have 2 bicycles kind of connected together, right? So I'm really curious to hear what those outcomes are going to be. And I know that you and I have talked internally, but we're going to have you come on once you have these results for a little update, because I'm sure our listeners are quite keen to hear. You just have to be a recurrent guest on this podcast. I am very curious also about these results, because I recall a study that had looked at partner dancing, but looking more at kind of a neuropsychological battery. So looking at different aspects of cognitive tests, and whether it's attention or focus or some of the different ways that we use our brain in our executive control systems, right? And so they had identified distinctions between people who were leaders and followers. So it'd be interesting to learn through these additional areas that you're looking at that aren't just looking at external function, but also what's actually happening in the biology of the brain. That's really cool.
Exactly.
I'm so excited. I can't wait. My little geeky self is barely keeping in my seat. We do always ask our guests, and I know that you're a recurring guest, but I'm still going to ask you this question. Is there something that's kind of coming up for you right now, either something that you've experienced or witnessed, that has helped you to feel the magic of dance on health and well-being?
Just go back to what we were talking about, to the social aspect of dance. I think it is really very important. I grew up dancing, and I mean dancing outside of the dance class. And dancing was really an important component of my friendships, of just having fun. And so I would just bring this back and say that this really played an important role in the person that I am today, and in how I see life, and in how I want to spend every day musically and rhythmically, and to enjoy it. So I would just say it really meant a lot for me to be dancing as a teenager and beyond, and as much as I can until today. And I would just keep that this really played an important role in how I'm thinking about dancing, and how I'm just convinced that it is a really important activity intervention for humans.
I agree. I actually have met several young up-and-coming researchers that or dancers who are also interested in research. So I thank you also for modeling that and demonstrating that maybe dance and science and neuroscience specifically are not as different as and diverse as we thought that they are.
Definitely not. And you need for both. We mentioned discipline, but I think that creativity and curiosity are very important for both of them. So there are many similarities, and I think that's why I'm also getting many people who, as you said, many people who have their major in dance, they tend to have other majors and minors in other fields. So it's not surprising to see that many people who come to me have a background in dancing. Having said that, you don't need to have a background in dance in any way to come to work with the group in the same way that you don't need to be a musician to study neuroscience of music, or you don't need to have any specific visual impairment or anything to study vision. I really want to welcome everyone to come join us, whether this is from the end of the participants who want to participate in the research studies or the up-and-coming researchers who want to be part of the research group.
Amazing. Thank you. That's all I can say. You're
Thank you.
Incredible. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we say goodbye today?
A big thank you for this initiative, for having me over again, for spreading the word, and for helping uplift this field.
Thanks, Constantina. This episode of Dancing into Brain Health was edited and produced by me, Magda Kaczmarska, and Hilary Brown-Estreffi. The music for this show is the title cut from the album Critical Path by Joe Venegoni and Carl Weingarten. Show notes, links, and resources from today's episode can be found on the Dancing into Brain Health webpage and on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.